Hello, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm Senior Associate Director of SAIS Alumni Relations. Today's date is April 2nd, 2015, and I have the pleasure today of meeting with three graduates who are celebrating 50 years from the class of 1965. First, we have on the left, Julie Fisher Melton, who graduated with her master's in 1965 from SAIS, and later from SAIS received her Ph.D. in 1977. In the middle, we have Saone Crocker, who also graduated with her master's degree in 1965. And on the right is Charles Micoleau, who graduated from SAIS with his master's in 1965 as well. And it's our pleasure to have you here today. We're just going to have a little bit of a conversation, and I'm just going to throw out the first question, which is what originally brought you to SAIS? And maybe, Julie, you can start the conversation.
I had a professor of international relations at Pomona College where I went, and he said, "You have got to go to SAIS." And he pushed me hard, and I didn't resist too much. So I came literally right out of college to SAIS. And I think it met many of my expectations. I loved the interdisciplinary aspect of SAIS. That had always been a struggle as an undergraduate because, and one reason I majored in international relations at Pomona was just because I could be interdisciplinary. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the reasons.
That's great. And what about you, Saone?
I had never heard of SAIS when I came here. I had graduated from the University of Cape Town, and I had a Fulbright Fellowship and an American Association of University Women Fellowship to come and study in the United States. And I had majored in international government and law and English in my undergraduate studies. And so it was actually the American Association of University Women and Fulbright who placed me, who said, "We want you to go to SAIS." And I was 19 years old when I arrived here and started SAIS.
Great. And that about you?
I had gone to undergraduate school at Bowdoin College in Maine, had taken enough international courses, and had spent a summer in Europe, that I had a choice. I wanted to go to graduate school. I had a full scholarship at the University of Hawaii. One might say, why did I end up in Washington? That sounds, in retrospect, if I were to do it again after 50 years, I probably would have gone to Hawaii and retired, but I didn't. SAIS was clearly the place to be in the 1960s, or Washington, D.C. was clearly the place to be in the 1960s, and that's why I came to SAIS.
Terrific. And now thinking a little bit about when you all were students here at SAIS in Washington, tell us a little bit about some of your memories. Julie, why don't you start us off?
There was a lot more smoking than there is now.
That's true.
And I got to the point where I think I was up to 2 a day because people were always giving me cigarettes, and I had this sort of, I don't want to do this, so I went back to 1 a month after that point. I think the student body was absolutely phenomenal, though. I have such wonderful memories of our class and just the variety. And there were a lot of foreign students here then, too, which was not as common in other university settings as it is now.
Now, I was interested in the fact there were people that spoke strange languages. I met Saone, I think, the first couple of days I was here. We were crossing Connecticut Avenue, and she stopped me and said, "Watch for the robot." I had no idea what she was talking about.
Yeah, my first memory of SAIS was standing in line to see Monsieur Moyen. Do you remember him?
Yes.
The French teacher, to tell us what, where we were in the SAIS thing. And in front of me was Maynard Toll, who I'd never met before. And he's very tall. He's way taller than I am. And he turned around to me looking terrified, and he said, "I'm absolutely petrified. May I get behind you to have a few more minutes?" And I said, "Sure, what are you afraid of?" And he said, "Well, I don't know the difference between French and Japanese. I've just spent a year in Japan, and I'm petrified that I'm going to go in there and speak Japanese and not be placed in my French class at all." By the way, at lunchtime I reminded him of that little episode, and he said, "I'm still confused by those two languages."
What are some historical events you all remember?
Well, we can't forget the fact that this building at 1740 Massachusetts Avenue was the first class to enter that building. And it was inaugurated with this incredible display of talent in that we had we had Dean Acheson, Christian Herter,
yeah.
and Adelaide Stevenson.
Right.
Who was the third? But they spoke at the inauguration of the building. So it was just an incredible introduction to world affairs. And of course, within a matter of 2 months, the Kennedy assassination took place.
Right.
Which is hard today to explain to our children, I think. But it just the world stopped that day.
I have a memory, which is I lived with 3 other SAIS students in my class on P Street. And what I remember is Barbara Hoffman, who was here today, coming back a day or 2 before the assassination. She had interviewed, and this was a particularly dramatic example of SAIS students at age 20, 21, 22, being able to get right into things, because she had interviewed Pierre Salinger, who was Kennedy's press secretary, and she came back and she had seen John Kennedy, and she was full of the sort of, I can only use the politically incorrect word of girlish enthusiasm for what she had experienced. And she said, "Oh, Kennedy came in and he had this blue shirt and he has these blue eyes," and she went on and on about him. And the next day he went to Dallas, and we were like in a morgue. I can remember cooking, sort of heating up our leftovers that the 4 of us had made. It was rice and peas, and all we did for 24 hours was eat rice and peas and mourn. It was something I had never experienced quite in that way.
Yeah, it was very, very haunting for me, coming to the United States for the first time and having this idol image of Kennedy. And I think also as SAIS students we felt very close to the event because the funeral took place just down the road here.
Yes.
And we saw little John saluting his dad.
Never forget that.
I'll never, ever, ever forget that. But we were also, there are a few other historical things of great interest. First of all, Julie and I, were there only 8 girls in our class?
Yes.
8 girls and out of 150 students. So I'll have to say, we had fun.
We did. There might have been 10, Sam, but we'd have to sit down and count.
Right, but there were very few.
We had a good social life, let's put it that way.
We did. And the other thing is the Vietnam War. You know, who was it? Yes. One of our classmates went to Vietnam and got killed. Do you remember who it was?
No, I don't. I remember a Pomona classmate who got killed, but I don't remember one from here.
So that was a very haunting framework for us in this country at that time, because you remember there were a lot of student protests and so on. We didn't really participate in that, but I think we were all fearful that classmates would get...
I have to ask a question of my friends here from the class, which is, did either of them have a class with George Liska?
I did not.
I did not.
We have actually done an oral history interview with him, though.
Is he still alive?
No, he passed away sometime this year. Yeah.
Well, my memory of his class, you know, he was highly theoretical, rather aloof. I wouldn't say he was a warm and fuzzy professor, let's just put it that way. And we had a class on the morning, and this is later, this is when I went back for my doctoral work, but he was here before and I think it's relevant. On the day that the Soviets invaded in Hungary in 1968, and he was, I believe he was Hungarian, wasn't he? I know he was from Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe. Czech, he was Czech. And, no, I'm sorry, I have to correct myself. It was the Czech crisis, and he was Czech. And people came in sort of one by one into the classroom, and he lectured in the way he normally did, and we were all dying to ask him about the events in Czechoslovakia. And somebody dared to ask him. And he said, well, we thought maybe he'd show some emotion. You know, it was his country originally. He said, well, when there's a power vacuum, the great power moves into the vacuum.
That was it.
That was it. And although I didn't have him as a professor the first time I was here, I know other people in my class who did, so I think it's...
It's relevant. We had some characters, actually.
Oh, yes.
I remember Charles Burton Marshall, and I was late on a paper. Do you remember him, Charlie?
I do indeed.
And so I went up and knocked at his door, and he said, "Come on in." And I said, "I'm really sorry. Get out." He said, "We don't apologize. What is. What did you do? When you were ready to tell me, come back in." So I've never forgotten that. He was a real character.
Now, SAIS, from our speakers at lunch, still has this very practical bent, what they call it functionality.
Yeah.
But you got to go back to the 1960s when the war was beginning, Vietnam War was beginning to heat up. The protests were beginning to take place. Civil rights movement was very much active in 64, 65. And you came to SAIS, and there was this strange curly-headed professor that came down from Columbia to teach in worldwide,
Wide world.
wide world.
Yes, that was.
It was hard to follow because he had such a thick accent. Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
And talking about mutual deterrence and mutual destruction and the capabilities. In fact, the only time the first year I visited the Homewood campus was to hear President Lyndon Johnson try to publicly negotiate with Ho Chi Minh by offering to build dams and provide electricity and schooling. And that was how he was going to end the war. And so you had this sort of very visible, practical bent. And I will always never forget a phrase that somebody wrote about, and said, "Washington is a place where the same conversations take place at the dinner table over the war, the pros and cons of the war," and somebody would say, "Well, why don't we just decide we're not going to fight and stop the war?" Washington is the place where somebody at that dinner table would get up the next morning and go to work and try to figure out how to stop the war.
Yeah.
As a practical matter.
I had an assignment when I was in the master's program here, which was to interview a desk officer of some country in the State Department. And I remember, I'm embarrassed, I think it was Ecuador. And I remember asking this desk officer, "Do you have any influence?" Because I think he'd been to SAIS. I think there was some connection there that I was able to get this interview. And I said, "Do you have any impact on U.S. policy toward Ecuador?" And he said, "Yes, actually I do." He said, "If I were on the Vietnam desk, I would have 0.
That's great. Well, that's actually a good.
So can I just interject a second? The Wide Wide World course. That was its nickname. It was really the United States of America in a changing world environment. So,
Good for you. I never read that.
I didn't remember that at all.
She got an A in the class. So anyway, I was just going to segue a little bit. I mean, those are wonderful memories, and as 65 May approached and you all went through graduation, think about the beginning of your careers and tell us a little bit about how they started and how they evolved, and any one of you may start.
Well, the same professor at Pomona who suggested SAIS almost immediately hired me. He was then head of the Foreign Affairs Division at the Library of Congress. And that was my first job. And I very quickly got into the job from Foreign Affairs Analyst, got promoted into being Latin American Analyst because a more senior person was on leave to a senator. So I was thrust almost immediately on leaving SAIS into the Dominican crisis in 1965. And my very first assignment was from a senator asking about the jurisdictional conflict between the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the United Nations in the Dominican crisis. And I can remember I had brought some of my books from SAIS to my new office. And I remember thinking, thank God I took international law at SAIS. Because although I didn't know the answer, I knew how to look it up, And it said the senator's going on television in half an hour. So none of this long-term paper you're writing. This was half an hour assignment like being a reporter. And I've always valued the fact that that SAIS prepared me for that kind of thing in my very first job.
Yeah, we used to joke that SAIS prepared us to read the newspaper intelligently, but it really did a lot more than that. And the international law class was absolutely fabulous, and the international economics, and also learning about Europe between the two world wars. I remember that class very well. But I started out working for the American University Foreign Area Studies Division, helping to write guidebooks for the Department of Defense on countries the Defense Department was going into. I worked on Zambia and Uganda. And then I worked for Africa Report, which was a magazine, writing, and then I ran a scholarship program for the Republic of Guinea, which sent over 40 students every year to study in the United States, and I organized that. And then Chet and I went traveling for a year while he was writing his Ph.D. thesis on the border conflict between Ethiopia and its neighbors. And after I traveled for a year, I came back and I actually took off 12 years and had 3 children. So I stayed home for a long time, and then I went to law school. And in my law practice, I combined law with international studies, did a lot of international work, did a lot of work in Latin America, trying to coordinate safety standards that were in the United States with facilities in Latin America that would be coordinated and compatible. And I worked in an area of the law called original jurisdiction law, which are disputes between states that go directly to the United States Supreme Court as a court of first jurisdiction. And I helped the Supreme Court resolve those cases. One was a big water rights dispute between Nebraska and Wyoming that lasted for 21 years. And the other was between New York and New Jersey, who had sovereignty over the landfill portions of Ellis Island, which was a fascinating case. So with the special master, we would run the trial and then write the reports to the Supreme Court. So
You're still needed in New Jersey because there's a question of access to the George Washington Bridge that sometimes...
I'd be happy to participate. Well, it ended up in the New York versus New Jersey case that New Jersey was actually had sovereignty over the landfill portions. That New York only had sovereignty over the sort of nut shape of the original 3 acres of Ellis Island. And it was landlocked. And so that's how it ended up.
Now, SAIS really was and continues to be transdisciplinary, where you sense how the interrelationships between different, not only academic disciplines, but real world problems. So in my case, I was exposed in Washington, here in Washington, with a lot of people that worked in the government. I became very interested in the war on poverty, and which was kicked off in 1964. And so I went back to Maine, where I had lived and done my undergraduate, and got involved with the war on poverty. And that, in turn, exposed me to some legislative affairs as we tried to enact changes in the law dealing with social services. And I worked for this fellow called George, by the name of George Mitchell. And George, at that time, was practicing law in Portland, and he was also Democratic state chairman. And I worked in that political environment, which ultimately led me back to Washington, where I was with Ed Muskie's staff for 10 years, starting at one level and ending up ultimately as his chief of staff. And then I went back to Maine to practice law, but principally energy law. So I think of Saone and her jurisdictional conflict. Perhaps the biggest project I worked on that lasted almost 8 years was to build a merchant high-voltage electricity transmission line connecting New Jersey with Long Island, New York.
It's a small project.
and undersea cable, and with multiple jurisdictions between the state of New Jersey, the state of New York, the island of Long Island, which has its own sense of jurisdiction, and the federal government. And
Wow.
I can't think of any better educational preparation than SAIS
That's
for
great.
building an
Wow, that's
undersea
terrific.
electricity
cable.
Maybe I could just pick up where I left off,
absolutely,
because I
yeah.
stopped in 1967.
Yeah,
which
I was going to come back
is
to
a
you.
long time ago. I actually worked for the Organization of American States for a few years on development, and then I got married, and like you, took time off to raise 2 children. But I did write my doctoral dissertation when I coordinated their naps. It was sometimes very challenging with 2 little boys. But came back, but didn't. I just took a year of. I had taken a year of classes in '68 here for the doctorate, and I finished the doctorate in the '70s while we were living in New Haven. And then I began doing independent consulting for international non-governmental organizations for a number of years, like Save the Children and TechnoServe and CARE and many others. And I basically focused on 2 themes. One was microenterprise development, evaluating field projects, mostly in Latin America. And the second topic, as I became interested in indigenous non-governmental organizations, was what was then called, and still is at times called, North-South partnerships. In other words, CARE would have ties to an indigenous NGO in a country where they were working. So that became another field of specialty. And along the way, I have now written 3 books on indigenous NGOs. I get very impatient with books that lump all NGOs together, because I think the international NGOs have some pretty fundamental problems, having worked for them, that it's not that indigenous ones are always great. They vary also, but I think they don't. There's less of a challenge of what I think my major professional frustration or intellectual frustration over my years and my writings. I just published a book a couple of years ago on democratization NGOs. Has been this idea, both in development, both in economic development, and now in promoting democracy, is that we in the developed West, North, whatever you want to call us, we know, and we're going to teach them. And the truth is often just the opposite. The truth is, if we could learn what they are doing, and then say, okay, now that we understand what you're already doing, how can we help? And I think that, unfortunately, I have not seen much progress on that, on changing that intellectual construct, which I think is fundamentally weakens some of the good things that we would like to promote. My latest book is called Importing Democracy, the role of NGOs in South Africa, Tajikistan, and Argentina. I did over 100 interviews in the 3 countries. And I use that title because we know now that exporting democracy militarily doesn't work. I think we also know exporting democracy, or even exporting development, doesn't work very well. And so that's sort of been the theme of my career. I've, along the way, done other things. I taught at Connecticut College, I taught at Yale, I got into the population field. I've had a sort of very eclectic, interdisciplinary career, so I guess that's partly due to my SAIS background.
That's terrific. Well, you've all had super illustrious careers and have done so much for SAIS in the world, and thanks for sharing all that. I think it would be really helpful to, as I talk through the helicopter in the background, to hear a little bit about, in thinking about current students today, what advice might you have as a sort of a final statement? Thinking about your 50 years and celebrating that, what advice might you have for a current student today? Charles?
If I think over that time frame about a big difference between 1965 and today as it relates to international affairs, we really do live in a global economy. And the ability to arrive at decisions with some modicum of consensus is so terribly important when you're dealing not only with Republicans and Democrats, but with different cultures and ethnicity. So my advice would be to recognize that the importance of working in an environment where you can bring about consensus and decisions, because the biggest obstacle to progress, in my opinion, is the inability of a society to make decisions.
I think I would give a few different pieces of advice that are sort of more generic and maybe less substantive. One, I think now we work for so much longer than we used to, that, like Julie, people should think about moving from place to place to place and learning a lot all the time and having different experiences and different careers, and not necessarily settle into one place for 35 or 40 years or whatever. I think it makes you into a bigger person. I would also urge women students not to lose sight of the values and satisfactions of family and how that lasts forever and your career doesn't. And I have, for example, my oldest daughter now is an assistant secretary of state, and she has 2 small children, and she focuses very much on the quality of time with her children and does her hours in such a way as to give them preeminence when she's with them, and they are very happy, wonderful children. And then I think I would just say, be true to yourself. So many people are over-ambitious or wanting too much money or wanting something, and life, it's a cliche, but life is short, and there's something very satisfying about being true to yourself. Looking yourself in the mirror sometimes and saying, am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing something worthwhile with myself? Is this who I want to be?
I can only echo that. I couldn't agree more. I think that one of the most satisfying things that you can do in life, if you can afford it, and I admit some people maybe not be able to for financial reasons, but to be able to say what I want to study, what I want to create in my scholarship, in my consulting, and whatever it is more important than who I am, what title I have, or where I go in life. And if you can do that, then you are free to be eclectic, you're free to be interdisciplinary. And what I said earlier about really appreciating what people are doing in the rest of the world depends on that open attitude toward research, toward what I call doing your homework, which many international players do not do. They go in with an idée fixe, as the French would say, of what has to be done. And doing that, stepping back and saying, okay, well, let me find out about this place. Let me find out who's doing what, where in this other country, for example, before I launch into some well-meaning crusade. So that's what I would suggest to students here, is that you take your time to enjoy the research, to really delve into it, to not have preconceptions, and to say, okay, now that I've learned something, what do I do?
Mm-hmm. And I would like to just add one P.S., which is to stay humble, always to stay humble. Don't get pretentious and full of yourself.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much. Congratulations on your 50 years. And thanks for sharing all of your wonderful stories, memories, advice. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.